Could probably get started in a minute. Looks like we can keep on adding people as they get in too.
Close that window. All right.
Let me stop sharing this for now, and I'll do a little intro. Okay. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live virtual program from the Howell Carnegie District Library. I'm Amber from the Adult Services Department. Thank you for joining us this evening. I have a few housekeeping items to share before we start the presentation. Tonight's programming is scheduled to run until 8:15. During the program, all attendees will be muted, so please share any questions for the presenter or report any technical issues you may have in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat throughout the program and can assist with any technical issues you may have. After the presentation, we'll address as many audience questions as we can before the program ends. And don't forget to visit our website, www.howelllibrary.org, to discover more upcoming events from the Howell Carnegie District Library. Tonight we have Bill Rapai speaking on the Kirtlands Warbler. Bill is Interim Executive Director of the Kirtland Warblers Alliance, an organization established in 2013 to help ensure the long-term survival of the Kirtlands Warbler. His organization is working to increase community engagement and build strong public-private partnerships for investment in the species and its management. He is the author of 3 books, including The Kirtlands Warbler, The Story of a Bird's Fight Against Extinction and the People Who Saved It, published by University of Michigan Press. The book was named a Notable Michigan Book for 2013. Bill also worked as an editor for the Detroit Free Press and the Boston Globe and self-identifies as an ink-stained wretch. Without further ado, I'll let Bill take it away.
Thank you, Amber. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for that nice, warm introduction, too. So I have to say that Kim, I talked to Brandy about it a little while ago, but I lost my glasses earlier today. So I'm going to be really a little bit out of sorts. So forgive me as we go through this. If I'm like reaching for my eyes or my face thinking that I need to adjust my glasses, I'm just kind of lost. But anyways, the Kirtlands Warbler, that's my little buddy there. Beautiful little bird, formerly endangered species. And just an absolute conservation success story and a reason why we in Michigan should be proud. Amber gave a great introduction of me. I guess the only thing that I will add is that I'm a lifelong birder and I'm interested in science and all about conservation. My mother was a science teacher, so the apple did not fall far from that tree. And of course, I'm the author of the book on the Kirtlands Warbler, which was named a 2013 Michigan Notable Book. I gotta tell you, I've written 3 books, but this is still my favorite. It was so much fun to write, and it's such a great story. Well, the story of the Kirtlands Warbler is essentially a Michigan story because the bird, 95% of the population is here in Michigan. And there are monuments to the Kirtlands Warbler around the state. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a monument to the Kirtlands Warbler on the lawn of the courthouse in Mayo, Michigan. And there's a Michigan historical plaque, the return of the Kirtlands Warbler at the Grayling rest area on I-75. As I said, primarily it's a Michigan story because 95% of the population lives here in Michigan. And it's an icon of their state that inspires passion. This is the right leg of Mike Petruska. Mike is a volunteer and of all things Kirtlands Warbler. When there's an event, he is there. He'll gladly take anybody out in the field to see the Kirtlands Warbler whenever someone asks. And when he takes them out in the field, he guarantees that they will see at least 2 Kirtlands Warblers. I hope you're laughing at that because I'm referring, of course, to the tattoos on his leg. Yes. Well, Kirtland's Warbler story is, a bird that is interesting, but also very rare. So people come from all over the world to northern Michigan to see it, and they go crazy when they do. Now, believe it or not, this picture is not from northern Michigan. It is from the biggest week in American birding, which is a birding festival in northern Ohio, and that is on the southern shore of Lake Erie. So there's off to the left there is one Kirtland's Warbler in the brush, and everybody has gathered around to see and take a picture of the Kirtlands Warbler. Yeah, that's how excited people get when there's a Kirtlands Warbler around. So as I said, 95% of the Kirtlands Warbler population nests in just 3 counties in northern Michigan. There's a tiny little population in the UP. There's a tiny little population over in Wisconsin. And there's a tiny little population, I need to update this map, over in Ontario. And during the winter, they spend the winters on the islands of the Bahamas, and then they migrate back and forth. It's a pretty cool. Oh, somebody just joined us. Hi, person number 5. Thank you for joining us. Let's see. Oh, why are we not? There we go. Oops, let's back up. So what causes a plant or animal to be placed on the endangered species list? Well, there are four main reasons why. Habitat loss, of course, which is the problem with the Florida panther, which you see there on the right. Human persecution, which is the problem with the wolf. People do not want to live near a wolf. Competition from invasive species. Down on the bottom, you see a drawing, an illustration of the blue pike, which is a subspecies of the walleye. And that was driven to extinction by invasive species. And of course, environmental factors. With the Kirtlands Warbler, we can point to 3 of the 4: habitat loss, competition from invasive species, and environmental factors. The only one that the Kirtlands Warbler has not experienced is human persecution. The population of the Kirtlands Warbler will always be small because it kind of has these persnickety nesting demands. It really wants to nest only in the perfect conditions. Young jack pine trees between 5 and 20 years old. They have overlapping branches. The Kirtlands Warbler will build their nest on the ground under these overlapping branches and on a sandy soil. So if you're going to nest on the ground, you don't want a clay-based soil because you want that water to drain through quickly. If the water sits on the soil, it builds up, it will very quickly drown the eggs. So you want a very quick draining sandy soil. And let's face it, there are not that many places where this combination occurs. We've taken fire out of the landscape. There's too many people now living in northern Michigan and in places in Wisconsin and Ontario to allow fire to run across the landscape, for the landscape to renew itself and create new young trees. So because of the lack of fire, there was, until we began to cut down mature trees and replant them with young trees, there was a loss of habitat. Fire is absolutely critical to this landscape. Everything here is built to burn. The jack pine cones will release their seeds under the intense heat of fire. They're sealed shut. The term is it's a serotinous cone. It's kind of like glued shut. And when the fire comes along, it will pop the cone open. It'll break it open, and the seeds will fall to the ground. But once that canopy from the mature trees is opened up, it will allow plants on the ground that have been dormant for as many as 40 or 50 years to come back and grow again until the trees are tall enough that they will shade them out and they'll go dormant again. Everything in this landscape is fire dependent. And of course, there's the invasive species factor, which is the brown-headed cowbird. Now, brown-headed cowbird is actually native to North America, but it's not native to northern Michigan, the area where the Kirtlands Warbler nested. The brown-headed cowbird created its nesting strategy by following the bison herd around the Great Plains. And instead of stopping to breed, then build a nest, then lay eggs and raise young and risk having the bison herd being 100 or more miles away, they decided that what they would do is they would just drop an egg into another bird species nest and then go on with the bison herd. And that egg would then hatch and be raised by the species that that built the nest and laid the other eggs. So yeah, when it got to northern Michigan, it discovered this new area that had been timbered over. It had been lumbered over. There were no mature trees left anymore. It looked a lot like the prairies that it had left. And it found the Kirtland's Warbler. The human connection to the Kirtland's Warbler begins in 1851 when the man on the right that you see there, the illustration of Charles Pease, he saw a bird on his father-in-law's farm west of Cleveland, and he shot it. He collected the bird, but he couldn't identify it. He had no idea what it was, but he knew what to do with it, and that was to give it to his father-in-law, Dr. Jared P. Kirtland. Kirtland, by all accounts, was an extraordinary man. He was in the first graduating class of the Yale University Medical School. Shortly after graduating, he moved west to Ohio. He became a member of the Ohio legislature. He studied the snakes and the mammals and all kinds of creatures in northern Ohio. He was also a botanist, and he shared his knowledge with local farmers. But for all of his knowledge on the plants and the animals in northern Ohio, he could not identify this species. So he gives it to Spencer Baird, the secretary of the Smithsonian. Spencer Baird just happened to be traveling through Cleveland from a convention in Cincinnati, and on his way back to Washington, Kirtland gives him the body of the Kirtland's Warbler, and Baird takes it back to the Smithsonian, and he compares it to all the other species in the Smithsonian and realizes this is something different. This is something new. This is a species that has yet to be identified. The following year, he writes a paper describing the bird for scientific literature, and he names it after Kirtland. 50 years passed, but nobody really knows anything about the Kirtland's Warbler. Now, you have to remember, this is the late part of the 19th century. The 19th century was full of scientific discovery across the North American continent. You had Lewis and Clark, you had Nuttall, Audubon, all these people who spread out across the continent to learn more about the flora and fauna of this new land. But nobody knew a whole lot about the Kirtland's Warbler. People thought that it might nest over in Minnesota or up towards Hudson Bay. So in ornithological circles, it kind of became a guessing game or a parlor game to get more information about the Kirtland's Warbler. Well, in 1903, there's a breakthrough. A man who is curator of birds at the University of Michigan, Norman Wood, receives a gift of a bird carcass from one of his students. The student was on the Ausable River in northern Michigan. He's fishing on a fishing expedition, but he hears a bird on shore. He doesn't recognize the call, so he shoots it and brings it back to Ann Arbor to Norman Wood. Wood immediately identifies the species of the Kirtland's Warbler, and he makes plans to go to northern Michigan to search for the nesting grounds of the Kirtland's Warbler. He travels for 3 days by train, by boat, by wagon, by foot, and he finally crosses the Ausable River, and he hears the song of the Kirtland's Warbler. Of course, to make sure that it's the Kirtland's Warbler, what does he do? He shoots it. Yeah, but this is how science was done back in the early 20th century. We didn't have high quality optics. We didn't have mist nets. So we did science at the end of a shotgun, unfortunately. So not only does he bring that specimen back to the university, he digs up the first nest, the first known nest of the Kirtland's Warbler, and brings that back to Ann Arbor. And, Wood is surprised that people locally knew all about the bird. They called it the Jack Pine Warbler. They were very, very familiar with the bird, even though science wasn't. Well, 1923 rolls around, and a brilliant young man from Chicago has left the University of Michigan. He was a student of Norman Wood's in the museum. He goes back to Chicago, and he decides that he's going to put together an expedition to go to northern Michigan to see the Kirtland's Warbler. His name is Nathan Leopold. Now, that name might ring a bell for some of you. Leopold and Loeb ring a bell? Yes, the Leopold and Loeb were found guilty of committing one of the most notorious murders of the 20th century. But in 1923, at age 19, this brilliant young man from Chicago, was the toast of the ornithological world. He goes to northern Michigan. He makes a movie about the Kirtland's Warbler. He learns everything that can possibly be learned about the Kirtland's Warbler. He writes a paper that is published in the Journal of the American Ornithological Union. He presents the paper at the annual convention of the AOU, and he is the toast of the ornithological world for spreading his knowledge about the Kirtland's Warbler. He's the first to connect the Kirtland's Warbler to the brown-headed cowbird and identify the threat of the brown-headed cowbird. What you see here is a Kirtland's Warbler nest with 3 Kirtland's Warbler eggs and 1 brown-headed cowbird egg. You'll notice that that cowbird egg is a little bit larger and a little bit more spectacled, but they're very, very similar. Now, think for a minute about a robin's egg. It's kind of blue. So a robin would know immediately that a cowbird had been in its nest simply because the egg would be very, very unlike a robin's egg. A wren's egg is a beautiful pink little pearl, and a wren would know immediately. But the Kirtland's Warbler is like, yeah, I guess that's mine. Maybe it looks a little bit different, but I guess that's mine. Now, you would think that a Kirtland's Warbler, a female Kirtland's Warbler, would leave the nest to go out and get some food, and it would say, you know, I laid 3 eggs. Now there's a 4th one here. What gives? But there were likely 4 Kirtland's Warbler eggs there, and when the cowbird came in and laid its egg, it removed one of the Kirtland's Warbler eggs to disguise the fact that it had been there. The brown-headed cowbird egg will hatch first. The bird will be larger. It will demand more food, and likely 1 or 2 of the Kirtland's Warblers will not survive. So you can begin to understand the impact that the brown-headed cowbird was having on the Kirtland's Warbler population. 1931 rolls around, and Lawrence Walkinshaw, a dentist from Battle Creek, starts his research on the Kirtland's Warbler. As a matter of fact, 1931 was an eventful year for Walkinshaw because not only did he begin his research on the Kirtland's Warbler, he also got married, and he spent his honeymoon in a tent with his wife in the jack pine of northern Michigan so that he could get up and do his research. I have a friend who is a little bit older than me who met Lawrence Walkinshaw years ago, and he said, Walkinshaw's wife was a peach. I can only imagine spending their honeymoon in a tent. Well, Walkinshaw was incredibly patient watching the male Kirtland's Warblers bring the female back some food and the young back some food. People saw him in the jack pine sitting perfectly still with blood trickling down his forehead. The blood was there because he had so many black fly bites on his forehead that it caused his forehead to start bleeding. That is patience. 1930s to 1940s, Jocelyn Vantine, who takes over as the curator of birds at the University of Michigan Museum, begins his research on the Kirtland's Warbler, which causes Walkinshaw to step aside. Because he doesn't want to compete with Vantine. Vantine was a giant in ornithological circles. As a matter of fact, he is so well respected and so highly regarded that the American Ornithological Union, one of their top research prizes, is named after Vantine. Unfortunately, Vantine died as a fairly young man because of heart disease. But luckily, working at his side was a businessman from Toledo, Herald Mayfield. Mayfield was a businessman, but he was also an amateur basketball player, and he suffered a stroke at age 29, which meant he had to give up basketball. So he looked around for something to do to keep himself busy, and he discovered that he really liked bird research. So he began working side by side with Vantine. And he took all of Vantine's notes and he wrote what would be the definitive book on the Kirtland's Warbler biology. But that's not all he did. He persuaded the state of Michigan to set aside land permanently to ensure that the Kirtland's Warbler would have enough land to be able to nest that young jack pine on sandy soil. He also, in 1951, in a conservation first, established an annual census. This was the first time that anybody had attempted to count the entire population of a species. It was something that was really, really special and provided us with a lot of data that prevented the Kirtland's warbler from going extinct. In the 1970s and 80s, the Kirtland's warbler becomes a symbol of conservation and conflict. The Kirtland's warbler, about 30% of the Kirtland's warbler population was nesting on the tank and artillery range at Camp Grayling in northern Michigan, which is a training center for the Michigan National Guard, the Ohio National Guard, the Indiana National Guard. So these troops would come to northern Michigan every year, and Governor Milliken and the Michigan DNR said, sorry, you're not going to be training here this year because you've got this rare bird on your base. And so you can imagine that it was not a popular idea. It was not met with, positively by the Michigan National Guard. At one point, the Michigan National Guard gave the Kirtland's warbler a nickname. They started calling it FLAW, for lightweight, feathered lightweight anti-tank weapon. Yeah, sorry for messing that up. My glasses, I'm sorry, I'm just out of sorts. 1980, the Mack Lake Fire. May 5th, 1980, the U.S. Forest Service tries to create some land for the Kirtland's warbler by burning some old forest, and it burns out of control. It runs across the landscape, burning thousands of acres. It kills a Forest Service worker who was trying to prevent the spread of the fire. It was an absolute disaster for the Kirtland's warbler. But it came along at the right time because it prevented the Kirtland's warbler from going extinct. Right about that time, there were fewer than 400 birds in the entire population. And because of the Mack Lake Fire, it taught the conservation, the people in charge of the conservation of the Kirtland's warbler how to save the Kirtland's warbler. Well, you can see in 1980 that there were about 200 total birds in the population, and you can see how it grew significantly as the Mack Lake Fire habitat came on board in the late 1980s. You can see then the population began to grow steadily as the Kirtland's warbler moved into the Mack Lake Fire and really utilized it for breeding purposes. So we began to realize that, hey, wait a minute, we've been managing for the Kirtland's warbler wrong all these years. We need to create much, much larger blocks for the Kirtland's warbler, and we need to mimic the land that we're managing to make it look like wildfire. Oops, sorry. So conservation goals have been met. We now have more than 4,000 birds in the entire population. The original Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Plan, written in 1976, called for 1,500 breeding pairs, and we've blown well past that. So the law required that the Kirtland's Warbler was going to come off the Endangered Species List. Luckily, there are safeguards in place. The Endangered Species Act requires a 5-year monitoring period, which we are in right now. Next year, there will be a complete Kirtland's Warbler census, the first since 2017. That will be the baseline for all the information, for the data for all Kirtland's Warblers population monitoring going forward. If something bad were to happen, if something terrible were to happen, the bottom were to drop out of the Kirtland's warbler population over the next 5 years, there would be an emergency relisting. They wouldn't have to go through the process of going through hearings or anything like that. They could just put it right back on the endangered species list. And the state and federal agencies that are responsible for Kirtland's warbler conservation have agreed to continue on-the-ground conservation efforts, the planting and cutting down of adult trees and replanting with young trees. And they're going to, of course, monitor the population to make sure that it won't crash. But we can't just wash our hands and say, we're done, because there's still a problem. The Kirtland's warbler is a conservation-reliant species, which means we need to build a new model for conservation. About 80% of the birds and plants and animals on the endangered species list right now are conservation reliant, which means they depend on human intervention to help them survive. The Kirtland's Warbler was the first conservation reliant species to come off the endangered species list. So we're building this new model for conservation. The problem is there's no more funding from Washington. Now that it's off the endangered species list, that money that's coming under the Endangered Species Act, no more. So what we need to do is we need to create a fund, a way to continue to be able to pay for this on-the-ground conservation effort that has got us to this point so far. In charge of this effort is the Kirtlands Warbler Conservation Team. I would have been in the photo, but somebody needed to take it. What you're seeing there are people from the Michigan DNR, the Wisconsin DNR, Canada Wildlife Services, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bahamas National Trust. These are all the agencies that are charged with protecting the future of the Kirtlands Warbler. So where are we now? Well, we've created a series of work plans that will guide us into the future, that we will follow to make sure that we're taking the right steps to ensure the Kirtlands Warbler will continue to have young jack pine trees for the breeding habitat. We're raising funds to build that so-called nest egg that will allow us to be able to pay for that conservation work going forward. We're working on human dimensions of conservation, Kirtlands Warbler conservation, because it's not just about the Kirtlands Warbler, it's about managing the people also who live in northern Michigan, making sure that they understand how important it is that this Kirtlands Warbler conservation work continues to go on. We're experimenting with how we plant the trees. Instead of just jack pine now, we're interspersing a little bit more red pine. That will increase the value of the timber stand when it goes to sale. So currently, the jack pine is a really, really bad species. You can't build with it. It's just a very low value species of wood. So what happens is when the Michigan DNR and the Forest Service go to sell off large plots of jack pine, they will put it out to bid, they'll get a bid, and guess what? It will cost more to replant that area than the money that they take in from the bid from selling the trees. So we're at a shortfall right there already. So we have to figure out ways to make sure that we're raising the value of those stands. So we're adding a little bit more red pine because red pine is a much more high value species. The other thing that we're going to begin to do is thin the jack pine after the Kirtlands Warblers use it. So if you thin the jack pine, let's say you've got three trees planted in a row, you take one of those trees out, it's going to cause those other trees to grow bigger and stronger and straighter. That will help it to be more value when it comes to selling that plot. And of course, we're trying to expand the breeding range beyond Michigan. 95% of the population nests in 3 counties in northern Michigan. What happens if something terrible were to happen, if there was a insect infestation that were to kill off all the jack pines or something terrible like that? Well, what we would want to do is to spread that population out. We want to see more birds moving into Ontario. We want to see more birds in the UP. We want to see more birds in Wisconsin during the summer, during those breeding areas. We're also working on improving winter habitat in the Bahamas. This is what the habitat looks like. It's called coppice habitat. And those trees, those plants are full of berries that the Kirtlands Warbler absolutely loves to eat. There's about 200,000 acres in the Bahamas right now, but we're very, very concerned that many of those acres are going to be ending up underwater soon with climate change. We're worried about the sea level rise and much of the Bahamas going underwater, unfortunately. And of course, there's the impact of COVID this year. Obviously, the Kirtlands Warbler has not contracted COVID, but it has had an impact on Kirtlands Warbler conservation this spring. We've been unable to plant, the U.S. Forest Service was unable to plant any acreage this year. The Michigan DNR did plant acreage, but it appears that 5 to 10 years from now, there's going to be a real shortfall of Kirtland's Warbler nesting habitat. There was no Kirtland's Warbler tours this year. There's no festival this year. 2020, who knows what's going to happen, if COVID's going to be gone, if the disease will run its course, or if we'll have a vaccine by then. But it appears that we'll probably not have a festival or tours again in 2021. And the biggest problem right now is that the Michigan DNR is having a budget crunch. COVID has caused a $1 billion plus budget shortfall, and the DNR is accepting a lot of that, those budget cuts, unfortunately. So we're not really sure how that's going to affect how the DNR is able to conduct Kirtland's Warbler conservation in the future. Excuse me. So my organization is called the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance, and we were created about 7 years ago to support the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. One of the things that we've done is we've raised about $70,000 to hire a coordinator for the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. The conservation team, what you saw there, are a series of employees of government agencies, etc. The problem is there's no one person who is in charge of that. So what we need is somebody who's going to be able to put together a plan for the conservation team and follow through on it. And this is a really, really valuable hire for the future of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team and Kirtland's Warbler conservation. Once again, we're going to be doing a lot of human dimensions work. We need to help people understand why that on-the-ground conservation work needs to continue, even though the Kirtland's Warbler is no longer endangered. People say, well, what does this bird need this for? Well, there's a good reason. And of course, we work with state and federal policymakers and lawmakers to help them understand why this work needs to continue. It would be great if we were to make the Kirtland's Warbler the state bird. Why is that? Because it would then obligate the state of Michigan to continue to support the Kirtland's Warbler. There's no question that they're not going to let the state bird of Michigan go extinct or have a population crash again. Come on. So why does this one bird matter? I struggled with this question for a while. And I learned that from writing a book on invasive species in the Great Lakes. I learned that every time you take a native species out, it makes the ecosystem that much less resilient. Every time you remove something, it endangers that ecosystem. It throws things out of balance. And so if you were to remove the Kirtland's Warbler from this ecosystem, there would be more insects that potentially would infect the trees. It has the potential of doing real severe damage on this ecosystem in northern Michigan. We don't really know what the impact is, but it is possible that there could be a real impact. So I love this quote from Leopold: "To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." Forgive me, I need to take another drink. So how can you help? Hopefully, COVID permitting, we will have a jack pine planting day in May of 2021. We'll be working with the Michigan DNR and other volunteers to plant 2 acres of jack pine for the Kirtland's Warbler. It's a really great way of coming out and learning more about the Kirtland's Warbler habitat and why the connection between the Kirtland's Warbler and the jack pine forests. You can make a donation, but I'm not asking for that right now. But I would love it if you were write a letter of support to your legislature to say the Kirtland's Warbler conservation must continue, and support for the Michigan DNR is really important. One of the things I'd like to leave you with is that it's not just about the Kirtland's Warbler. I mentioned that it's about the ecosystem. If something comes out of the ecosystem, well, there's a problem. Yeah, the ecosystem is really, really important, and everything in that ecosystem is critically important to the proper functioning of the ecosystem. We've taken fire out of the ecosystem, so we try to manage it as best we can. But we're taking a much more landscape perspective these days. It's not just about the Kirtland's warbler, it's about everything that's in that ecosystem. So I'm going to leave you with my contact information. Please feel free to give me an email at the Kirtlands Warbler Alliance at gmail.com. You have our website there and our address. And I'm going to say thank you and take questions. And forgive me once again, I don't have my glasses and I am just like way out of sorts tonight. So forgive me. I really appreciate your, there we go. I really appreciate your forbearance.
All right. Looks like there was a question of what is the current state bird? Looks like Kim answered it right away. It looks like, I think it's the American robin.
Right, and the current state bird is our state bird only by tradition. So it's not state bird by law, it's by tradition. So back in the early 1930s, when states were beginning to find symbols that would represent the states, people said, we really need to have a state bird, a state fish, a state tree, et cetera, et cetera. So Michigan Audubon put together a contest for children around the state. And they said, what do you think our state bird should be? And the children in Michigan chose the robin. Michigan Audubon really, really, really wanted the Kirtland's warbler, but the children of the state of Michigan chose the robin, so that it went to the legislature, and the legislature said, sure, we're going to make the robin the state bird by resolution. So they created a resolution that said the robin will be the state bird of Michigan. But resolution is in effect for only during the time that session of the legislature was sitting. So as soon as that session of the legislature quit, the robin was no longer technically the state bird. So we just don't have a state bird.
Do you know if would be a process to suggesting a state bird?
That process would be going through the legislature, of course. It has happened a couple of times back in the 1960s, and again about 12 years ago. There was movement to get the Kirtland's warbler named the state bird. The problem is the people who proposed the idea weren't very well organized, and members of the legislature were not going to go out on a limb and vote for the Kirtland's warbler as the state bird without having a real sense that there was a lot of support for this statewide. So because there was no really groundswell of support for the Kirtland's warbler, the legislature said, we got more important things to do.
Let's see. Brandy had another question. What drew you personally to the Kirtland's warbler so much to write a book about it?
Back in the early 2000s, back about 2010, I was writing an article for Michigan Audubon magazine, and I contacted somebody who said, hey, what are you doing right now? You need to write a book on the Kirtland's warbler. I said, write a book? And I had 2 young kids at home. I'm like, well, I'm going to write a book. But the more I began to think about it, I said, this is probably a great opportunity. There's so many things that get in the way. Not only do I have 2 young kids, how many people say, I'm going to write a book and then never start it? How many people start a book and never finish it? How many people finish a book but never get it published? Well, there were all those barriers there, but I said, this sounds like a worthy project. And I'm so glad I did it, because I met just tremendous people who were so incredibly dedicated. And that's what I did with the book, is I told the story of Kirtland's warbler conservation through their eyes. You will probably not find that the I personal pronoun anywhere in the book, because it's not about me. It's about the people who dedicated their lives, that demonstrated their passion for the Kirtland's warbler to make sure that it wouldn't go extinct.
Any other questions?
Oh, come on. Please make me earn my money tonight. Well,
All right. Well, I shared a link to our events calendar and to a little Google survey. Oh, looks like one more question from Brandy. Is the Kirtlands Warbler your favorite bird?
I have to admit that it's not. It's right up there, but it's not. My favorite bird is probably the chimney swift because I have them flying over my yard all summer. And that day in late April when the chimney swifts return, it's, that to me is always one of the best days of the year to hear the chimney swift chatter overhead and to see those guys flying overhead. It just means, yep, spring is finally here. So the question from Kim is, this is the only type of warbler that was on the endangered species list. As far as I know, yes. There may be a warbler species in Hawaii that is on the endangered species list. I don't know. There's so many native species in Hawaii that have been put on the endangered species list, but I'm sure that that's the only one in North America. The golden wing warbler is getting close. The population of golden wing warblers struggling. The population of the cerulean warbler is struggling. But as far as I know, the Kirtlands warbler was the only one that was on the endangered species list. And at one point, we were fewer than 400 birds in the entire population. Is there something specific about in the bird's physiology that makes it a warbler? Yeah, it's a classification. So you have this group of birds that are similar genetically, that they're considered warblers. And one of the reasons why they're called warblers is because they all have unique calls. They all have unique songs. Brandy, you probably heard the Kirtlands warbler singing earlier. But yeah, that's what makes them warblers, is they're all genetically very, very close together. I mean, you got to call them something. So why not call them warblers? Because they have really great songs. Sorry, after talking for 30 minutes plus, I'm a little parched. All right.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, thank you, Bill, for sharing about the Kirtlands Warbler with us. And thank you all for attending tonight's program. There's a link in the chat to our event evaluation. So if you can, take a few minutes to give us your feedback on tonight's program, and you can visit our website, howelllibrary.org, to discover more upcoming events from the Howell Carnegie District Library. If there's no more questions, everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Night, everyone.